Guys, welcome to the second De Novo Elements panel on nutrition. I apologize for my noob status on screwing up the last recording. So Lane is not with us, neither is Andrew Kutnick. But we had to re-record. I think I have it figured out. If not, then you guys will not be seeing this. And if you are seeing it, then I figured it out, yes. But as always, thank you guys for submitting all your questions and for tuning in. Without further ado, we will get started. The first question is, does timing of fat intake affect fat storage? Does the macronutrient ratio affect fat storage after meals? And do carb and fats lead to more fat storage than other macronutrient distributions? So there's an A, B, and C to that question. Mike Nelson, you want to start us off, and then we can kind of revisit it if we didn't hit all three heads.
Yeah, so the answer I'll give is a little bit more mechanistic and specific to his question. The bigger question is, does any of that matter for fat loss, which I think is kind of a separate question. I would say the answer for that is probably not directly. Obviously, calories matter the most. Yeah, maybe some stuff you can do with partitioning, but it's definitely in the minor component of that. So does the time in a dietary fat affect how much fat will be directed to adipose tissue versus used as energy? Kind of, but I think that depends upon what you're actually doing at that time. So if you're exercising, obviously more will be diverted just because you're using more energy. If you're sitting around, and I tried to actually find a tracer study on fat, and there isn't really too many. Maybe somebody else knows of some. So if I'm just sitting around and I do a shot of olive oil, like what happens and where does it go? Some of that can be used for fuel. The catch there, it also depends on how well your body is using fat at rest. So we know that that's actually quite variable. So I did one study on that. Helms did one study on that. Niejadlik did another study where they just took people at rest or under very low intensity exercise. They hooked them up to a metabolic cart so they could measure how much fat versus carbohydrates they were using. And the short answer is it varied by about 20 to 93%. Right, so some people at rest are pretty good at using fat. Some people at rest are not as good as using fat. The catch with that, so when you're doing a metabolic cart, is you can't really determine where the fat came from. So that's kind of the catch on that. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I guess the answer for that part depends. Does a macronutrient ratio during a meal affect this? A little bit. The main thing that would be out of work there would be insulin. Obviously, your body has other things independent of insulin, like you can still store things, so insulin's not the only thing, but it's probably one of the main drivers. I think insulin's better thought of as a fuel selector switch. I think I stole that from Jeff Bullock. So if your insulin is super high, you're actually burning more carbohydrates, consequently storing more fat. If your insulin is low, you are using a higher percentage of fat. So in that case, if you have a low level of insulin, you do, in the acute sense, use more fat. Which usually the next question then is, well, does fasted cardio actually matter then? The only long-term study on that is from Dr. Brad Schoenfeld. In that study, he didn't show any effect in terms of fasted versus non-fasted cardio. Again, one study. So we do know that acutely, you can increase more fat use. Does that matter chronically? Yeah, I'd say pretty debatable at this time. So will eating carbohydrate or dietary fat together lead to more fat storage rather than having a meal consisting of solely carbohydrates or fat or mixtures? I would say maybe, but it's probably not going to matter in the big picture. Right, so in theory, if you whack up insulin super high, taking a bunch of carbohydrates, which will do that, taking a bunch of fat, in theory, you could have a little bit more stored as fat. But again, that goes back to what are you doing at that time? How was your body, using fat, things of that nature. In the grand scheme of things, is that going to make a massive difference? I would say probably not. So the last thing I would add in terms of practice, I do have some people consume protein and carbohydrates before training. So I do like to increase insulin levels a little bit, try to blunt some of the stress from training. The other meals, I do tend to have less carbohydrates for most people, but I think that's usually more out of trying to get everything to fit and have lower periods of insulin at that time. Again, that's probably a little bit more for health reasons. And in simplicity, I can have someone do their low or their off day, kind of 4 meals, and then I can just add more carbs before and after their training. So from a practicality standpoint, that makes it pretty easy. So does it mean if you have carbohydrates and dietary fat in a mixed meal, is that really going to negatively affect your gains? I would say probably not. I know that's a whole big answer of it really depends.
Yeah. So I'm going to attempt to package that in a little box if possible, but
yeah,
this is open to everybody if I totally screw it up. So I'm going to try to use an analogy that I guess is more real world relatable, because I think the big part of the question is to most of the individuals listening, what is practically significant or
right.
impactful rather than clinically. And I think a lot of the things that you mentioned definitely clinically would probably interest all of us, but I think the name of the game for most people who are asking is like, is it going to get me leaner or shredded, or is it going to get me bigger? And how can we address that, I guess, briefly? So I guess since internally in our cells, they do operate like a combustion engine, we'll use kind of the fuel in a car analogy. And your expenditure would be like hitting the gas. The only difference physiologically is that for us, we basically can keep eating beyond our tank being full, whereas in your automobile, you'll overfill your tank and it'll spill over. But we'll revisit that spillover term. So acutely, if you're eating too much, you can short-term store more fat. But does that mean you are fated now to being a fat ass, basically, because you overate once, or maybe you had, like you said, Mike, high insulin that drove more of that substrate into fat tissue? It doesn't. In 24 hours or 48 or a week, you will revisit those fat storage because it's a dynamic flux. So if you are pushing your gas pedal more, you'll use more fuel. If you're not, the fuel will stay in the tank, so to speak. And again, the difference with a body and a car is that you can build upon an already full tank by adding more fat, which you can't do in an automobile. So I guess to try to put that all into one sentence, there's a very big difference between acute and chronic. And chronically, it probably doesn't matter as long as your distribution within the day and your total intake are well controlled. So splitting hairs, like getting really lost in these things, will probably actually be more risky to the individual for long-term adherence and goals or gains, rather than just really focusing on the base of the pyramid, which should be like 90% or so of what we're focusing on. Anybody have anything to add to that? Because I know I kind of jump around a little bit. Or did that make sense?
I just have one more thing to add, too, is that the follow-up sort of in the weeds question that comes up with this is, if we could somehow sort of block fat from going into the fat cell, what happens then? And I can't find any human data on this, but there's a rodent study that did a knockout study where they actually genetically engineered these mice for that to happen. And you would think then that the mice would get leaner, and they didn't really get significantly leaner. But what happened was, because the fat could not be exported out and stored in the fat cell, because it started backing up via the liver as super high triglycerides, so super high levels of fat in the blood, which is not good and not anything anybody wants. So I think the only thing you can try to sort of hack the system, as much as I hate that word, I just used it, is if you can increase your fatty acid oxidation, so allow the fat to actually get out to wherever it needs to go, and then increase basically how much of it is actually being burned. So part of that is a percentage of fuel mix you use, and obviously how many calories you're burning also. So I think that can help get around that a little bit. And I think from a health standpoint, if you're at rest, burning through a lot of carbohydrates, my gut feeling is that's a metabolic risk. You should be using more fat at that point. But like you said, does that matter in terms of body composition? Probably not. So.
Anybody else have anything to add before we move on?
I kind of feel like we're lacking just a very straightforward kind of clarity point around the question, if you don't mind. The question implies to me that the person, like you said, Ben, doesn't really realize the difference between acute and chronic effects. And yes, if you eat a lot of calories and they're combined of fats and carbohydrates at any one time, you will store more fat than if you ate less calories or if you had just carbohydrate, for example, which might drive insulin, but there's no fat, and then you're not going to be storing much. However, whatever you store at that time, if you're on a fixed number of calories, when you don't have those calories later for that part of the day, you have to pull from endogenous stores, which means you'll burn fat. So it's just like a bank account. If you're working with $1,000, it doesn't matter if you deposit all 1,000 at the beginning of the month or 303 lump sums. Your net balance at the end of the month is really what you care about. And for the most part, especially in the population we're addressing, and the person asking this question, when you're exercising, attentive to your diet, healthy sporting person, you're not going to have any kind of metabolic dysfunction that will change the name of that game in any kind of significant way. So you probably would be better suited to not develop an eating disorder by trying to worry about combining fats and carbs throughout the day and focus primarily on a reasonable macronutrient breakdown and a habitual eating pattern that is consistent, that still meets your target macronutrients and calories.
Yeah, I think we approached it from quite a few angles and gave a good amount of analogies that hopefully we addressed it. So let's move on to question 2, which is switching to clean eating from iifym better in terms of micronutrition? So Pete, would you like to start us off there?
Yeah, so I think the biggest misconception there is that clean eating and iifym are separate things. Like you either do clean eating or you do iifym, and you see if you go on social media, you see this argument and debate all the time. You have the bro who says, "Oh, you can't eat whatever foods and get lean," and on the other hand, you got the guy who said, "No, watch me eat pure ice cream and donuts and some protein shakes and get lean." And they don't have to be mutually exclusive. I mean, I normally, I'm of the opinion that, for a healthy human being that's concerned about, losing weight, getting in shape, overall health, 80-90% of your food probably should be coming from nutrient-dense food that's dense, has a good amount of micronutrient content. And then if you want to fit other things in moderation, that's fine. And so, I wouldn't say that it's mutually exclusive. And I think that, if you're someone who's doing clean eating and you're switching to more of tracking macros rather than just eating specific foods, I still think most of those foods are probably what's going to make up the bulk of your diet. It's just that you have the flexibility to have other things and the realization that when you fit some things in moderation, you'll be okay as long as the bulk of your diet is, made up of more micronutrient-dense foods.
Yeah, I think at the heart of this question is really just nutrient density. It's not about quote unquote clean or superfoods or marketing terms. It's more so about just the reality of the clean foods are just the nutrient dense foods, as in they have less calories and a lot more micronutrition than stuff like Pop-Tarts and the seen as, like you said, evil foods, which just have a lot of calories and a lot less relative micronutrient or macronutrient density. Anybody else feel compelled to chime in on that one?
I do.
Okay, go about that. Go ahead, both of you. Whoever wants to go first.
You go first now.
Yeah, so with iifym, really all we're doing is just giving a system to track and quantify what we're eating. Just like Pete said, they're not mutually exclusive, clean eating and iifym. You can still eat clean foods and track the macronutrients from them. And one concept that I think often gets overlooked is we don't eat nutrients in isolation. We eat whole foods. Those whole foods have the macronutrients, the micronutrients, but they also have the bioactive compounds like phytochemicals, other compounds that we've yet to identify that have positive health benefits. And when we eat those whole foods, we get all of those compounds and all of their benefits.
Eric?
Yeah, I would just say it's also really important to point out that the definition of clean eating is nebulous and will change depending on who you're talking to. And there has been research that has shown that certain groups have such a restrictive definition of clean eating that they actually lose micronutrient density because it's so restricted. So it's highly possible, depending on how you define clean eating, that you might be worse off eating clean. And the backing up of my claim comes from dietary surveys of bodybuilders in the 80s and 90s who found that they had a consistent group of micronutrient deficiencies, which Pete and I talked about, and along with Alan Aragon, in our paper on recommendations for natural bodybuilders. So I think it's more important to focus on including micronutrient-dense foods rather than trying to exclude foods that are quote-unquote bad, because sometimes the criteria is so restrictive as to actually leave out foods that have a lot of nutritional quality, like white potatoes, which have a different profile than sweet potatoes and have a lot of useful nutrients, and that's just one of many examples.
Yeah, those are excellent additional points. I don't want to move on unless anybody else has something to say, because those definitely enhanced I think our response. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was just going to add one thing to what Mike said too about having more nutrients in foods, and foods aren't just one individual vitamin or mineral or phytonutrient or something like that. And I know this is something Lane brought up the last time we recorded this, but when I was at Illinois, there were labs that specifically studied polyphenols or specific like sulforaphane out of broccoli, or specific carotenoids like lycopene or something like that. And oftentimes you would go to these seminars where they would isolate these individual compounds and they'd give them in ungodly amounts to rodents or something like that, or people. And a lot of times you didn't see the change you would expect when you looked at these nutrients in isolation. You saw it with the whole food, but when you start pulling individual nutrients out of it, you don't really see it. And I think that goes back to what Mike was saying about eating whole foods. We eat whole foods made up of a lot of different compounds.
Yeah, I think another time point that's appropriate to quote Dr. Volek, which he said to me years ago, people don't really realize that eating a food is really like eating a pharmaceutical cocktail. And it's very true. And what you learn through really going through a lot of nutrition coursework is that, especially with micronutrition, imbalance can actually inhibit the absorption of others, and that happens with micro and macronutrition. So actually, one element to the question of this was, can supplementation fix the gap, the perceived gap of eating iifym? And although I think we addressed that first part on why the view of it is inappropriate, the other aspect is, which is inappropriate, is replacing nutrition with multivitamins, or you can even say getting your micronutrition from like protein bars or other stuff like that, because it is very different. Again, I realize I'm being redundant, but just to really highlight the point you made, Pete, is that when you separate this thing, it really is like taking a drug. And a lot of times it doesn't even get absorbed the same way you think it would, as it would in a matrix of multiple different nutrients. So, yeah, nature is great. The end. Moving on to question 3. When in a deficit, if you overconsume on one day, should it be accounted for the following day? Eric?
This is a good question, nice and practical, and it kind of highlights the difference between people who are when studied and surveyed, classified as those with a flexible dietary restraint or a rigid dietary restraint. And what I'm talking about is actually the root of where flexible dieting came from. Flexible dieting is not just iifym. It actually comes from eating behavior questionnaires that identify the way people look at food. And those who are more successful with weight loss maintenance typically associate with a flexible restraint model, and they naturally, quote unquote naturally, not always, they can definitely learn this behavior, see that if I overeat on one day, that's not a big deal. I can just consume a little less the next day, or even meal to meal, they make these corrections rather than seeing a diet as either being on it or off it and having these good food, bad food associations that typically are not sustainable, which is why those with a rigid restraint mindset tend to develop more eating disorders, not lose as much weight, or not be able to keep it off. So I think it's important to point out that yeah, of course, you can just extend the time frame you're looking at energy balance and still have successful long-term weight loss. And I think we typically operate on a 24-hour basis, but there's nothing wrong with working with a 48 or 1 week and just thinking about trying to keep your weekly calorie intake associated with the goal of weight loss at whatever appropriate deficit you want. However, I find that when people come from a rigid restraint background, they often trend towards an unhealthy extreme version of this kind of trying to balance things. And you see people struggle with intermittent fasting, and it becomes kind of this prescribed binge at night. Or post-contest, when people are very susceptible towards overeating, they will overeat on one day, then heavily restrict the next to try to make up for it. And it creates this cyclical approach that starts approaching, bulimia almost. So I think it's important to have some kind of structured flexibility if you find that this isn't something you can naturally do. And I normally say a plus or minus 20% on any given day's assigned calories is a reasonable kind of flex to prevent massive undereating or overeating that would actually prompt that cycle to start and continue.
So the real name of the game is really sustainability.
Always.
Yeah, whatever fits in that framework most of sustainability. Anybody else have anything to add there?
The only thing I have to add is that I may be the minority here, but I do use intermittent fasting. But the intermittent fasting I use, again, not with everyone, mostly for body composition, is to take one period, one day, and push out the fast over several weeks. So they're only doing it one day per week, eventually working up to maybe 19 or 24 hours. And I actually got this from Brad Pilon years ago, and I liked what he said is that once you're done with the fast, just go back to your normal eating and pretend like it never happened. So I tell people that if they did a fast and they tend to overeat after that, then they just pushed it too hard, so they need to scale back, right? Because what I don't want, exactly what Eric said, is that this period of, I'm just going to not eat, and then I'm just going to overeat tomorrow, and then I'm just going to not eat, right? So you don't want them on this, roller coaster. And then usually I'll have that be, I'll have email them, what day of the week are you going to do it, what meal are you going to have after, right? So again, it's still a controlled type thing too, but it has some degree of flexibility. They don't have to do it every Monday. They could do it Wednesday or something like that too.
Well, I think we're touching on an important point to bring up, which is why multiple different interventions work, not just nutritionally, but also programming-wise. Which again, it's not so much about this one weird trick. It's more so really about what allows you to do it and adhere to it long term. Yep. So that's why you see this result, the success with Atkins or keto or iifym, or I'd argue probably shorter term clean eating. But again, what becomes the major, I think, threat to long term keeping the weight off or sticking to the new habit is self-control. So obviously, again, is it sustainable or not? And I think a lot of people approach the question as like, I want to lose 20 pounds for X event. And then it becomes this crash thing, and you're not even approaching the problem long-term with long-term thinking. Because again, this habit, to keep that change, you need to sustain the new habit. So yeah, I kind of just wanted to address that before moving on. Anybody have anything else? Alrighty, next question is, for purposes of maximizing muscle protein synthesis, is 13 grams of protein and some carbohydrates in a 4-to-1 ratio beneficial intra-workout? Would inhibiting protein breakdown make it beneficial? And would this change if you're in a fat loss phase or a muscle gain phase? Eric.
Simple answer is no. Complex.
To all three, right?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
More complex answer is that what modifies muscle protein synthesis, and we'll say muscle protein balance because the person was also asking about degradation, in an acute term may or may not relate to long-term body composition changes. And there's a number of reasons for this. So the actual study designs that exist to answer the question this person's asking, they typically last 6 to 12 hours. And the traditional model that's been around for a little over a decade now is that there'll be a chemical tracer attached to the amino acid, and we're looking at the rate that it incorporates into muscle mass. And this is in response to protein feeding and some type of resistance training protocol, or one or the other, in various populations. And this is where the original anabolic window for protein idea came from. And by the now famous meta-analysis and review by the Propocalypse crew, Schoenfeld, Krieger, and Aragon, of course, basically found that there was a pretty big disconnect between acute data and chronic data, especially when you started to control for total protein intake. So one thing we forget is that when you are adding protein or carbohydrates around a workout, and that doesn't change the rest of your day, that's not just assessing the effect of timing, it's also assessing the effect of additional nutrients. And in that meta-analysis, when they controlled for the additional protein intake, they didn't find a statistically consistent positive effect. That said, if you were to actually just look at the raw data, for the most part, even when correcting for that, there may have been a small effect size leaning on trivial in about 3/4 of cases. So you could make the assessment that maybe as a bodybuilder or someone who's trying to maximize every potential variable, it wouldn't be a bad idea to have protein around your training to some degree if you're trying to maximize hypertrophy. To get back to the mechanistic point, though, yes, insulin as a response to carbohydrate suppresses protein breakdown. However, there is an insulin response to protein itself, specifically, the branched-chain amino acids, or rather, and that reaches the physiological level, which kind of gives you the max suppression of protein breakdown. So there, at least for the purposes of gaining muscle mass, there's probably not a benefit to consuming carbohydrate with your protein, although it's totally fine, unless you actually got to the point where you're experiencing glycogen depletion, and then you will need to train that same muscle group again in less than 24 hours. So it's a relatively short time period where that probably would matter. Maybe a CrossFit competitor competing at games or doing multiple events, perhaps a bodybuilder who is training with a high body part frequency and potentially doing glycogen depleting cardio training. Then you would probably want carbohydrates post-workout before the second event. But that actually doesn't have to do with muscle protein breakdown. It has to do with glycogen replenishment, which I'm not an endurance guy, so someone can correct me on this. I think the original reason for that 4-to-1 ratio was to actually increase the uptake of glycogen. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would assume so, yeah.
Yeah, depends the type of carbohydrates used too, over the timing window too, due to the change in transporters in the gut and that kind of stuff.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I was more or less right there. But yeah, I believe the magic of that 4-to-1 window was originally related to glycogen repletion rather than enhancing protein synthesis. So that's a good point of clarification. Correct. Asking the question. So I think that about covers it.
Yeah, I think just again, kind of in summary, these things are great for us to discuss because they're fun intellectually to think about and discuss. But I think practically, they are more intellectual entertainment than practically impactful. So I think just, again, something to reiterate in really the theme of a lot of these questions is look at the fundamental things that are driving adaptation and progress. And those should really predominate like 99% of your thinking. If those are ideal, or I'm going to use the word perfect, but we can split hairs on that, but we're not going to. If those are really nailed down, then I think things like this are worth addressing. But for example, if you're not progressively overloading in training, if your adherence sucks with, sticking to your current protocols or anything like that, those are way bigger things to address than any of this stuff. And I will say this from my own experience, so it doesn't sound like I'm trying to, chastise other people without knowing what they're doing. I would, in my own pursuit of gains, get lost in this stuff so much to the point where it would actually threaten those other things. It would be very distracting. So I think it's just important to note that because I think it's partly a marketing thing, and it's just a perpetuated thing in fitness that you need to be doing everything perfect to get this magical, however many pounds of lean body mass per year. And we see all the time in real life so many things that like living, breathing examples that fly in the face of that. And it's like, well, I'm doing all this stuff perfectly, I'm weighing everything down to the gram, and then this dude just comes in and looks great, and he's blowing all of my numbers out of the water. It could just be that he has great context. I mean, obviously he has great genetics, but he has great context on things, and he's just enjoying what he's doing too, and that is helping drive progress better. So I'm going to step off the soapbox, and if anybody else has anything to add there, speak now.
Yeah.
Go for it, Pete.
Well, I was just going to say the one thing to keep in mind, I think, on that topic too, is stress. If you're worried about every little detail, I mean, you are stressing like mad. I was guilty of this earlier in my training career too, and I've made far more progress since I've just chilled a little bit. Yep. But just stressing so hard about everything, I mean, it can just, oftentimes if you're stressing really hard during like a contest prep, it can make you have to push a lot harder to see loss than, if you just chill a little bit.
Absolutely.
And that can lead to more muscle loss and not looking as good on stage. And, also just the stress side of things too. If you are so worried about every little detail, maybe some of those details help, but if you're so freaking stressed, is the benefit you're getting from it worth it? And are you going to be able to do this long term, or are you going to just hate what you're doing? And so often you see like a newer, someone who's newer to, bodybuilding or lifting weights or, what have you, and they focus on all of these little details, and that's fine if you're, you can focus on those things, but if you're focusing on them to the point that you just hate doing what you're doing in a year or two and just stop, I mean, it's definitely not worth it. So, I mean, I think it's about, finding that balance of, okay, maybe some of these things will help, but how much of this can I realistically do long term and, actually enjoy what I'm doing? Because, I know Ben also brought up, the guy with the good genetics, he may also just be enjoying what he's doing, even though what he's doing spits in the face of stuff that, science shows probably works better.
Yeah, I think psychologically we like to justify our kind of like masochistic behaviors in fitness. It's almost like a medal of honor or something. And I think one real threat of doing that is burnout. And because you almost teach yourself that you have to suffer to get what you're looking for. And then you are sacrificing so much of life to get those things. You say, I can't justify the sacrifice anymore, so I'm just going to stop altogether and just like almost go cold turkey from all of the, the really strict habits. And the reality is, again, there's a gradient in there. It's not, black and white. And, it's something you learn in like 100 level ex-phys classes, which is the acronym KISS, which is keep it simple, stupid. And the reality is like anything that the panel or anybody I think in our group who's doing as a coach or consultant or anything is really focusing on you adhering to those fundamentals. And then the little fine tuning is often just saving you from yourself. It's not, this magical intervention that, we all meet in, this tower in some undisclosed location in our, like monk outfits. And yeah, all right, I'm done going. You get the point. You get the point. Anyway, anybody have anything else there?
Yeah, this is on the same question, but not on the same kind of thread of it. Just because I was thinking about the nature of the question, they're asking about protein synthesis. This person is probably reading research, or at least reading people interested in research. I think it's a very useful heuristic for a practitioner or an athlete to think of research is that the research that applies to you is, surprise of all surprises, applied research. And when I say applied research, it's basically the last link in the chain before you put something into practice. And they're measuring a variable that actually that directly is performance. Typically they're measuring performance, like strength, probably in context of this panel, or a change in body composition or muscle thickness or cross-sectional area. If the study is not measuring those variables, that means it's probably measuring something that is mechanistic, a mechanism that should impact one of those things. However, the only time a practitioner or an athlete would want to look at a mechanistic study is in the absence of there being the availability of applied research. Basically, mechanisms inform applied practice, or rather applied research. Applied research informs practice. So if you're looking at muscle protein synthesis studies, no matter what a muscle protein synthesis researcher might tell you, in my opinion, that shouldn't be extrapolated to practice.
Yeah.
You can make some very couched conclusions, but really what you want to, if they're not directly measuring a variable you care about, that study is interesting at best, in my opinion.
Well, it's funny that you bring that up, though, because refinement, especially academically, it's your job to get lost in pathways and almost to see everything, through the lens of that pathway. And I think for at least practical recommendations to people, it can get us pretty lost a lot of times, because you start to lose scope of things. And I think this happens with education and anything. It's like if you learn about I don't know, if you spend your life learning about weather patterns, you could freak out about like what things are saying of when the next tornado is going to happen and freak everybody out and make them paranoid. You know what I mean? So I do think to some level, I'm definitely not looking down on education, but I think it's important to realize the bias that sometimes comes with it, that you see a lot of time the arguments that you see at either conferences or any kind of fitness, whatever, summits, of somebody sees something through their lens of specialty, the other person sees it through theirs, and they're just arguing beliefs, and it's confusing everybody. So yeah, there's
I would say some of the biggest rabbit holes that exercise science and nutrition have ever gone down is from extrapolating a mechanistic study to practice.
Yeah,
I would say the hormone hypothesis, the idea that we need to structure our hypertrophy guidelines around manipulating growth hormone, that was basically the late 80s through early 2000s. That's 20 years of research to now realize that is, at best, a very small piece of the puzzle. Or the insulin hypothesis, that just because insulin is a quote-unquote storage hormone, although I think the way Mike T. Nelson talked about it being a fuel selector switch is much more accurate, being the reason why we should minimize carbohydrate intake for fat loss. And now some of the work out of Kevin Hall's lab is showing that is actually not the case. But yet we've had, again, multiple decades of work completely based on that mechanistic hypothesis, I think is... and it's not even the person asking the question's fault. It's the researcher's fault who don't recognize where they fit in with that chain of mechanism to applied to practice.
Yeah, I just have one quick thing to add, too. One of my catchphrases, and I don't know who I stole it from, is that research provides the direction, and then me-search provides the answers. Right? Because at the end of the day, the person really wants to know, what is the answer for me? They could give two craps about what the research says, right? And so then obviously people take that and go, well, research doesn't mean anything. But to me, I agree with what all you guys are saying, is that we need to look at the research as a whole. What's the level of evidence? What is the closest thing related to the result that we want? And then, okay, let's add this and on an individual level, and let's see what happens, right? And make sure you're actually measuring something then. Are you measuring strength? Are you using HRV to measure markers of stress or whatever, so that you can then tell that, okay, I made this change. I did get a little bit better. Or, no, that didn't really seem to make much difference, right? I think then you go full circle back to the things that we know impact stuff: nutrition, training, overload, sleep, stress, all those types of things. Once you get those pretty much in order, then you get down to a little bit more of the fine-tuning. So, for example, for fine-tuning, I have found that it's anecdotal, but if someone takes quite a while to recover from a strength training session, sometimes 48 hours or longer, I will test out giving them a crap ton of carbohydrates after training. Measure their HRV the next day and measure their training performance. Yeah, usually most people do a little bit better. Is that going to save a horribly designed program in someone who sleeps 6 hours a night? No, it's not going to make any difference there. But I think that framework allows you to kind of take the big picture things and then kind of drill down to what is important on an individual level too.
Yeah, Mike, but it works for me. All right, like that's all that matters.
I used to argue with those people, and now I'm just like, that's cool, bro.
Yeah, there is actually something within what you said that I'd like to just highlight briefly, which is that a lot of what we're talking about, like the more refined stuff, again, comes from addressing the mean, like a study. And I know, Eric, you brought this up before too. It's addressing the mean, and the reality is we are all individual data points. And so that doesn't mean that a lot of the fundamental research doesn't apply to you. When we talk about the first principles or the foundation of this, those things pretty much apply to everybody as human beings. But a lot of this more, I think, highbrow, refined, mechanistic stuff, or the practically applied stuff that came from mechanistic stuff, it might not always apply as strongly. Because we are kind of all snowflakes, or like I said, individual data points. So, yes, we all get our participation medals for humaning. But yeah, again, I don't want to spend too much time being redundant, but just that the it works for me thing with highly specific, crazy protocols, I think is an extreme. And again, it's just important to almost catch yourself or realize the extremes and maybe assess how important or impactful they are. Moving on to our fifth question. This one's for you, Mike Niejadlik. Weigh chicken after it's cooked for the most accurate macros.
So we just talked about stressing the small stuff.
Yep.
So
yep.
Really good transition. The biggest thing with this is being consistent. So pick one, stick with it. Further, when after you weigh it, look in the tracking app. It's going to say whether these are the macros for cooked or raw. Just use the appropriate one. Any differences in weight from cooked or raw are going to come from lost water or fat, depending on the cooking method. So it's just be consistent. Yep.
That the last two words I think are really key there. I'm going to assume nobody else has anything to add, but go ahead.
I can't help it. Just super minor point is just that when you look at a food label, it is always the uncooked raw macros. Just so you know, if you actually do have a food label, of course most meats don't have a food label. But
anybody else? Assumption was stupid. Make an ass out of you and me. Anybody else? All right. Next question, Pete Fitschen. This one's for you. This is another three-parter. First part is if calories are equated, are carbs and fats interchangeable? So can you just track calories and protein? And when trying to optimize body composition, which is more important, consistency or flexibility? So those probably can all be lumped up into one answer.
Yeah. So, I mean, my first thought would be that, it depends on what your goals are. If you are, for a lot of my clients who are not, maybe the competitor's not dieting for shows, or maybe they're not competitors to begin with, they're just looking to lose a few pounds. A lot of times I'll do something like a calorie range and maybe like a protein minimum, or if their dietary habits are kind of poor and they're not very good at food variety, maybe serving a fruit and vegetable minimum or a fiber minimum or something like that, just to make sure they're eating some food variety while they get their calories and protein. And then at that point, as long as they're not going to crazy extremes in carbs or fat, they're probably going to be, they progress just fine. There's no issue. I think where the issue starts coming is when intake starts getting really low and someone starts getting really lean. I a lot of times, say, I compete. I've dieted down to stage lean 5 times in my life, and I'm crazy enough to plan on doing it again in the future. Dieting down to stage lean is, those of us who do it are freaking nuts. It's an extreme goal. It's probably going to take a lot more sacrifice than goals that are less extreme. And if you're crazy enough to go after an extreme goal, sometimes you do have to be a little more precise. And I think dieting for a show, especially near the end when intake's low, I do think that having, tracking carbs and fat separately is probably going to be something you're going to need to do, because you only have so many calories to go around. And so we know we need adequate protein intake, and I know with some of Eric's research suggests that we need more protein, at least in a gram per pound basis, when we're dieting than when not. There's some sort of fat minimum we're going to have to try to stay, above to support hormone production. And then we still, at the same time, are going to have to try to get some sort of carbohydrate intake to support performance in the gym, because carbs are going to be what's primarily fueling training. Fat is also, but primarily carbs. And so, you're going to need to balance all three. And you only have so many calories to go around. And so when you get to a point where intake's low, you're probably going to have to track each of them more accurately, just to try to get the most you can out of each of them within your caloric allotment. But if your intake's higher and you're not a crazy person dieting for a show, you probably can interchange them as long as you're not going to extremes with either, and as long as you're getting your calories, protein in, not going crazy extremes with carbs and fat. Like we talked about earlier, eating some good, eating some food variety, a lot of micronutrient dense foods, you're going to be okay. And what was the second part of that question?
When trying to optimize body composition, which is more important, consistency or flexibility?
Consistency is going to be most important. And I think it comes down to, and that may mean more flexibility for some people. It may not. A lot of times when people first start tracking something, if it's too flexible, they may not be able to adhere to it very well. Yeah. And for some people, other people, they're not good at following rigid things. And so the more flexibility is better. And so, I would say consistency, because like we talked about earlier, there are so many different ways you can create a caloric deficit and drop weight. And drop body fat. But I think the important thing is, what can you consistently do for a long period of time and adhere to long term, because that's what's actually going to help you sustain progress. And one thing, I gave a talk at a local gym here a couple months back, and a lot of my talk focused on just consistency and adherence. And one thing I opened the talk up with is saying, well, if you're going to start any dietary approach, you need to ask yourself, can I see myself doing this in the next 1 or 2 years from now? Is this something I can actually do? If not, then you're going to fail. You need to find something that you can say, all right, well, this is reasonable. I can, sustain this approach and stay consistent. And if you do that, you're going to have better long-term adherence and success.
So in one sentence, to address the first two parts of the question, is it's basically a negative correlation. So like as calories drop, then it becomes more important to worry about tracking the other macronutrients. And I think the general theme of like every question is consistency and long-term adherence. Before we move on to the last question, anybody else like to chip in?
Is there a third part to that question?
Yeah, the third part was the consistency versus flexibility. Yeah.
Never mind. Okay.
So last question is, should I implement branched chain amino acids and creatine into my regimen? De novo branched chains don't include glutamine. Why is that? So again, context with adding in branched chains and creatine. I think it's pretty clear that creatine is going to be the more beneficial, impactful one to your performance. That's going to be tangible if you're not currently doing that. But again, even that's a what if question of what is your nutrition. Not everybody, even everybody whose number one goal is performance needs creatine. It does depend on your current consumption. It's just become more convenient, I think, to just take the powder rather than eat pounds of meat a day to yield the 5 grams. So definitely, if we're looking on an expense basis and a results basis, creatine is going to be much more impactful than branched chains. The second part of the question, which is why don't we include glutamine, is number one, it's not a branched chain amino acid. It's conditionally essential, whereas branched chains are essential amino acids. And B, for performance, it really doesn't, for exercise performance, it really doesn't do anything notable that you're going to notice that makes it worth the addition or the cost. And that trend has really started to go towards the wayside. If you've noticed, just as a consumer, glutamine isn't included as much in products. Now in clinical nutrition, they do, but I'm going to let someone else chime in on why that is, because I know we had a pretty good group discussion on that, and I don't want to take the whole time up myself. So anybody else who, Eric, I think you were talking about glutamine and gut health and stuff. So.
Oh yeah. It's funny when I'm going to keep referencing this paper like it's the best thing since sliced bread, but when Alan, myself, and Pete's nutrition paper on bodybuilding went through review, they asked us to expand on glutamine a little bit, because it is true there's really almost no good data that suggests it has a beneficial effect on body composition or performance, but there is a fair amount of data that suggests it could improve gut health in certain conditions if that's a problem. Interestingly enough, the reason why it probably doesn't affect performance or muscle mass is because it's the same reason why it might be useful for gut health, is that something like 80% of glutamine is taken up in the intestine and doesn't actually reach your muscles. So you would have to megadose, but even then, it probably wouldn't have much of an impact. And all the studies on like burn victims who heal faster, they actually have an IV glutamine, and they're getting it directly, so they don't have to worry about that. So I would say that glutamine is not it's not a sports performance supplement, but perhaps in certain clinical conditions that I wouldn't be familiar with because I'm not a clinical guy. Ben, you probably know better than I would, or Pete. Glutamine might help with gut health.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pretty much covered all of that, at least for what's relevant to people who will be listening. Unless we have, that's going to sound bad, unless we have burn victims listening to nothing against anybody, but I just don't think that is going to be the demographic we're hitting with this. Anybody else have anything, closing remarks, anything else? Actually, we'll just...
Part of the question's on branched chain as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, they said, should they implement branched chains and creatine into their regimen?
I actually, and Epoch may not like me on this, I think some of the most recent data actually might suggest that leucine alone might be better than branched chain amino acids as far as having an effect on muscle protein synthesis due to competition, which is kind of cool. Also, this is a win for De Novo. They're one of the first companies ever to actually add additional leucine to their whey blends. So I found it. I think you guys have probably seen that recent study at a Stu Phillips lab where they compared just a lot of whey or some whey with additional leucine, just BCAA. Yeah.
So it was like 5 grams of leucine, if I remember right. Does that sound right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to address both of those points because I think they actually are important for the consumers who either purchase Epoch or purchase other pre-workout or intra-workout supplements. I totally agree. Like they're definitely not. I think we saw this explosion of popularity with them because, in large part, probably due to Lane's data and the impact of them, especially centrally to any kind of performance product, really isn't going to be that much to write home about. One thing is they are a good substrate. We'll put it this way: they're an expensive substrate in lieu of adding more glucose during exercise. Because part of the benefit of branched chains is they bypass the liver and they go directly to the muscle. So, but again, I will stress that yes, it's an expensive thing. You can just take more glucose instead to get substrate. The other part about the protein is we actually used to fortify. Now we don't. That's actually it's just a really high potency leucine isolate that we're able to get. But the original Max MPS had the leucine flakes in there. But interestingly, you can't label that as because it's an added amino acid. So you're not supposed to factor that in to the protein count. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to try to find a more potent.
You were doing good protein spiking.
Yeah, I was going to say the inverse.
Right. But as it's seen by the FDA, it's still spiking. Now that doesn't mean, I'm sure there's still people who taurine spike right now, or any other nitrogen spiking. Doesn't mean it stopped people from doing it. But yeah, that was actually a few people brought that up as a crowd favorite, like the confetti crystals in the protein that would separate. So yeah, any OGs who bought the really original old version? Yep, Eric and Berto, first two customers. Yeah. Now I will say our labeling has improved dramatically since, and packaging. It used to be in a Ziploc bag. Yeah.
Pragmatic.
Yeah, exactly. It was also much cheaper than to produce and purchase, but. I will do my closing part, and then if anybody else wants to add anything, you are more than welcome to. But basically, that's everything we had for the nutrition panel. I'd like to thank everybody for coming on and participating, and anybody who's listening or who tunes in. These are really fun. I'm going to speak for all of us here to do, but mostly for me, I enjoy these. So thank you guys for submitting your questions. Please continue to, and hopefully they're beneficial to everybody. Anybody else have any closing statements before we sign off? Nope. All right, guys, we will see you next time for the physiology panel.